When in my daily life, I act like a secret agent and tiptoe around even mentioning Jordan Peterson's name. Look around, please. There's a lot of great people in this room. This thing truly has gone worldwide. And you know, most revolutions, when they come for bloody, if we do this one right, it'll be done with ideas. And the guy that I believe is at the center of the right ideas is the guy I'm about to bring on stage. So make some noise for Dr. Jordan Paterson, everybody. Woo!
So maybe it was okay. I don't know, maybe that's a hallmark of success as a consequence of visiting Sweden. I was to annoy the Swedish foreign minister. That might be a good thing. I had a discussion when I was there. I don't remember actually if it was in Denmark, whether it was in Copenhagen or whether it was in Stockholm, about the conundrum that the Scandinavians are facing. You know, they've done more than any other nations in the world to produce a gender equal society. And one of the consequences of that is that the differences between men and women have got much larger rather than much smaller. And the scientific evidence for that now is so overwhelming that even psychologists from Berkeley have admitted that it was true. And so you know that that's as true as something can get when it defies radical left-wing logic so thoroughly and indisputably that even people at Berkeley can't deny it, that it must be true. So, but it leaves the Scandinavians in somewhat of an awkward position, but it's the same position that all of the countries in the West and in the world are going to be in as we become richer and our societies become more egalitarian in their provision of equality of opportunity, which is that men and women will get more different, because that seems to be what happens when you give people freedom of choice, and then that drives differences in occupational choice, for example. And so one of the things we're really going to have to figure out over the next 20 years is what to do now that it appears impossible to simultaneously maximize all outcomes and all opportunities. Because for a while, I think people hoped that that was a possibility, right? If you made your culture flat in some sense and removed as many barriers as you possibly could to advancement and to choice, that would make people more the same, and that would make outcomes more the same, occupational choice, perhaps salary, distribution of income, and all of that. But it doesn't look, that isn't what the data are revealing. What they're revealing is quite the contrary. So it was interesting to go to the Scandinavian countries and have a chance to talk about that. And it'll be interesting to see how that rolls out politically. And part of what's happening at the moment is that there's quite a movement in Scandinavia. No doubt it's happening here. It's also happening in Canada to develop gender-neutral kindergartens, for example, or gender-neutral parenting styles. And, you know, I think that that's quite appalling, personally, given that I don't actually think that there's anything wrong with the fact that there's males and females which is a good thing since there actually are males and females. But I'm also not that concerned about it in some sense, because I knew this 25 years ago. If you take avowed feminists, for example, who have become mothers and who have decided that they're going to treat their children, boys or girls, alike, and you compare how they interact with their children, if you compare them to people who don't have the same doctrine, you find that there's very little difference in the actual interactions because, well, first of all, a lot of the way that you interact with your children is actually a consequence of your children rather than your ideology, you know, unless you're a hideous parent. Because, well, I mean that technically, I suppose, because, you know, if you have a good relationship with someone, you actually personalize it to them, right? And it does look like in families that are functioning well, the dynamics between the parents and the children are very personalized. So even the micro-environment of each child is quite substantially different. You can tell that if you look at studies that look at the similarity of personality between siblings. So you can say there's 3 reasons that siblings might be the same. Biological similarity, shared environment, so that would be what they share in common in the family, and then non-shared environment. That would be what happens to them that's individual, that their brothers and sisters don't also experience. There's almost no effect of shared environment. You think, well, what does that mean? Does that mean that parenting doesn't matter because shared environment doesn't have much of an effect? And, well, no, that isn't what it means. It means that you don't treat all your children the same because they're not actually the same. And that's actually a good thing. So, you know, these things, like so many things that we discover if we apply scientific methods to the analysis of various phenomena, it turns out that they're much more complex and tricky than we'd ever imagined. And they don't necessarily line up with our a priori empirical or our a priori ideological conclusions. And so, anyways, that was some reflections on the visit to Scandinavia. And it's kind of a nice introduction, I would say, to what I want to talk about tonight. I'm going to talk about Rule 1. Since I've come to Europe, and I've done a dozen lectures now, this is the 12th one, and the last one in the UK, I've been working through my book backwards. I've worked through it, this is like the 92nd city I think I've been to, and so I've worked through it forward, and I've worked through it by grouping different rules together, and you know, I've tried all sorts of variants because I like to make the lecture each night unique and different and get somewhere new with it. But I'm down to Rule 1, and it's a strange rule in some sense because I talk about things that people don't necessarily expect, like the biochemical similarity between lobsters and human beings, and that strikes non-biologists as rather strange. I mean, it's actually the case that, you know, a fair bit of what we know about biology and about human biology actually comes from studying creatures that are even simpler than lobsters, crustaceans. They're not that simple, actually, lobsters. I mean, you try to assemble one from scratch in your basement, and you'll find that out. They're very complicated creatures, and they've been around a long time, and so, and they're alive just like we are, and you know, at some unbelievably distant point in the past, we shared a common ancestor, and that looks like about 350 million years ago, which is a long time, way before there were trees, for example. It's a long time. But there are evolution, like once biology conjures something up that works, it tends to conserve it, and it tends to conserve it for very long periods of time. And so you can find amazing similarities between creatures that have diverged from one another ages, eons, millennia, millions, billions of years ago. Billions is pushing it, hundreds of millions. And biologists know this quite well. They study things like learning in flatworms, for example, and flatworms are pretty damn primitive. They study fruit flies and all sorts of creatures that that have a short gestation period so that you can look at genetic effects over time. Nobody ever questions whether or not the findings that the biologists produce as a consequence of studying creatures other than human beings are applicable to human beings. They're not exactly perfectly applicable because obviously there's variation among animals as well as similarities, but the general rule is continuity in life. And you can be accused of anthropomorphism with regards to animals, which is the attribution of human traits to animals, but that criticism really died a somewhat painful death back around 1960 when people realized that the criticism was actually reversed. You should assume that animals and humans are alike unless you have reason to assume otherwise. That's much more in keeping with the notion of biological continuity across the species. So I've been accused of anthropomorphizing lobsters, for example, and they are quite a bit unlike human beings, but in some interesting regards, they're quite similar. And in the first chapter, I was actually trying to make a point about that, like a serious variety of points, but one really serious point, and it has to do with hierarchies. And so the first thing I want to do is talk to you about hierarchies. The most real things that you encounter aren't necessarily the things that you can easily see. Like numbers are a good example. It's like mathematicians like to debate the reality of numbers, and normal people are included in that discussion to some limited degree. And numbers are obviously a form of abstraction, but then there's something that's truly real about them, right? Once you lay out numbers and you can start to manipulate them, man, they give you a grip on the world like nothing else. And so the discovery or invention of numbers, what was it? Was it a discovery or was it invention? Well, that's not so obvious, but most mathematicians, I would say, would go with discovery. And it's like, well, it's not something that you see, a number, or you can taste or feel or sense in any concrete way, the same way you would detect an object, but number is real, and really, truly real, in that it gives you a grip on the world. It's one way of thinking about what constitutes real. Real is useful. That's not the only way of thinking about what's real. And so there are lots of things that in the world that are real that aren't evident to your senses. And definitely one of those things is hierarchy. And, chimpanzees, for example, and this is true for lots of primate groups, they really understand hierarchical position. And so, for example, there are aristocrats among most primates, and there are peasants. That's one way of thinking about it. It's quite hereditary. And so, if you happen to be a rather large juvenile peasant primate, and there's a rather small juvenile aristocrat primate, you'll tend not to pick on him. And the reason for that is that your nervous system, which has done a very good job of mapping the hierarchical relationships between everybody in your troop, knows perfectly well that that little primate that you could take out in 2 seconds is connected to a bunch of other ones that will tear you apart if you make a mistake. And so primate nervous systems are and not just primate nervous systems, but complex mammalian nervous systems are wired to respond to the existence of hierarchies with modulation of motivation and emotion. So the perception isn't direct. It's not so much that you would see something, but you would certainly experience it emotionally. You'd be afraid, for example, or maybe you'd have respect, whatever that might be among animals. And one animal, if you have 2 dogs, one of them's dominant. It's almost always the case. And I don't know what the non-dominant dog feels towards the dominant dog, but it's something like respect. It's something, maybe there's a bit of fear there, but it's still a perception that's embodied in an emotional reaction. So anyways, you can perceive hierarchies even though you can't see them. And you do perceive them, and it's unbelievable, and deep, deep parts of you perceive them. And now, I want to talk about, for a minute, about about why hierarchies in some sense are both prevalent and inevitable. So let's start with prevalent. See, the problem with most animals is that they're competing for scarce resources. And so you see hierarchies form to allow for preferential access to scarce resources in the absence of continual combat. And so in chapter 1, I've been criticized by people who haven't read the chapter for only for comparing human beings to lobsters, and for making the case that just because lobsters are hierarchical doesn't mean that all other creatures are. First of all, I never said that all other creatures were. I said that a very large preponderance of creatures across a variety of species are, and that human beings are as well. Chickens are, for example. So if you're a farmer and you go out and you feed your chickens, there's the chickens that get the chicken feed first are the same chickens every morning, and then so the aristocratic chickens get their food first, and then the second-rate chickens get the hangers-on get theirs next, and then the sort of bedraggled, low-status chickens get theirs last. And you might ask, well, why do the low-status chickens put up with the second-rate feed? And the answer to that is that it's better to be a little hungry and have substandard food than to be a little hungry and have substandard food and be pecked to death. Right, and so animals organize themselves into hierarchies around scarce resources so they don't add continual combat to the problem of scarce resources, right? So it's better to know your place. Not that it's necessarily pleasant or good, but it's better to know your place than to be continually fighting at risk to your very survival for that place. And so it's also the case, once a hierarchy is established, that it tends to be pretty stable because the cost of disrupting it is extremely high. Now, competitive animals, especially if they're interested in advancing their mating opportunities, will sometimes take the risk to make a move up the hierarchy. But they do that at extreme peril, and so they do it very carefully. So one of the reasons that we produce hierarchies, that hierarchies are spontaneously produced, is to produce something approximating stable peace in the face of scarce resources. Now, you get hierarchies that form even in animals that aren't very social, like songbirds. I also used them as an example in the first chapter. Wrens, little birds. I don't know if you have wrens in the UK. You have wrens in the UK. They're little birds. They're very feisty. They'll knock other wrens off their perches. They'll fill other birds' houses with sticks. They're very territorial. And the reason the birds care about territory is because if you're a bird, well, territory matters. And so what do you want if you're a bird? Well, you want to put your nest somewhere, and you want it where it's not too windy, and it's not too cold, and it's not too sunny, and where the rain isn't going to rain on it too much, and that's far away from the predators. So those are high-quality nesting. It may be close to food, that'd be a plus. And so they're high-quality nesting places, and you can imagine instantly there's a hierarchy of high-quality nesting places, right? Because some are going to be better than others across all those parameters, and then there has to be some competition that determines who gets access to the high-quality nesting areas, and that's exactly what happens. And then the more feisty, physically healthy, dominant birds that have the most sort of threatening song, because that's part of what a wren's song is. It means, here I stand, attack a singer of my prowess at your peril, right? And then those birds attract mates that are of high quality because the mates are looking for a high quality nest and a good place to have some eggs, and then those chicks are more likely to survive. And if an avian virus comes sweeping through the population, the birds die from the bottom of the hierarchy upwards. And the reason for that is that the birds at the bottom are stressed, they don't eat as well, they're more stressed by predation, they're not sheltered as well, etc. So they're immunologically compromised, and so if something comes along that will affect birds, then the birds at the bottom die. And it's the same with human beings. There's an old saying, when the aristocrats catch cold, the working class dies of pneumonia. Right? And that's technically true. There was a great series of studies done in the UK called the Whitehall studies. They're very cool. So it was done on 2 sets of civil servants about 75 years apart. So imagine there's a hierarchy of civil servants. And there's like high status civil servants, and then there's low status civil servants that are barely clinging on to their job, and then you track them across time, and you see who's most likely to die. And the answer is the civil servants along the bottom. Okay, so now that was the first Whitehall study, and then the second Whitehall study was done 75 years later. And what was so cool about it was that by the time the second study was done, which was in actually rather modern times, the average living standard of the low status civil servants in the second study was probably higher on average than the high status civil servants in the first study, right? Because everybody had just got so much richer. So the absolute level of wealth had gone way up, but the relative risk of death remained unchanged. So one of the things that's really rather brutal about hierarchical organizations is that they are associated with mortality risk. And so that's part of the reason why we tend to regard them as real. Now, all right, so now the next question might be, well, so you have animals, and the reason they organize themselves into hierarchies is because they compete for scarce resources, and they have to do that in a manner that stabilizes the competition without undue conflict, right? So that makes reasonable sense. And you might think that the same thing would be true of human beings, so it's a matter of, and you might think, well, the animals do that by expressing power, and that the same thing is true of human beings. Well, the first thing is that it's not exactly obvious that the more complex animals structure their hierarchies purely as a matter of power, let's say physical prowess and the ability to physically dominate another animal. So there's a primatologist who I admire greatly named Franz de Waal, and he's studied chimpanzee hierarchies to try to, because they tend to have a more masculine structure, so the most dominant chimpanzees tend to be masculine, although there's a female dominance hierarchy as well, and some of the female chimps are far more dominant than some of the male chimps. Overlapping hierarchies, say, but at the very top it tends to be males. And it is the case that if you're like quite the staggering physical specimen as a male chimpanzee, that's a non-trivial advantage in establishing, let's call it dominance or prowess or authority, because, you know, we might want to use a plethora of words just to make sure we don't close off our interpretations too early. It is the case that that gives you a leg up in the striving for position, and that in turn gives you a leg up with regards to access to food and also to preferential mating opportunities. And so the higher you are in the chimp hierarchy, the more you are likely as a male to leave offspring. It's not because the chimp females are choosy about who they mate with, by the way, which is quite interesting, because a chimpanzee female that's ready to mate, because they have mating cycles, they have estrus cycles, they'll pretty much mate with any male. But the dominant males chase away the subordinate males, and so they accrue the opportunities to themselves. It's one of the things that makes human beings quite unlike chimpanzees, because human females are selective maters, and that's a major, perhaps even the major difference that's driven us apart over the evolutionary landscape of the last 7 million years. It may not be the only thing, but it's a major driver. Anyways, one of the things de Waal has shown quite clearly is that brutally tyrannical chimps tend to meet a terrible end young. And why is that? Well, I don't care how strong you are as a particularly Arnold Schwarzenegger-esque chimpanzee, but 2 subordinates, 3/4 your strength can easily take you out on a bad day. And so that's exactly what happens. And chimps are very, very strong, and they're hunters, and they have very powerful teeth, and they tear each other apart. So when two subordinate chimps decide they've had enough, and they go after top tyrant, it's not a good day for him. And De Waal has documented that in some brutal detail in his multiple books on the emergence of morality in chimpanzees, actually. Very, very good books, very readable and well worth attending to. He's one of the scientists that's striving to produce something approximating a biological account of the emergence of morality. And there's lots of biologists working on that idea, and with a fair bit of success as far as I'm concerned. What De Waal found instead was that the chimpanzees, males, that tend to engage in reciprocal interactions with other males, so friendly reciprocal interactions, which means they have friends, from the chimpanzee perspective. And chimps do hang around together, and they have relationships that can last for multiple years, and they do groom each other, and they do support each other in battles and all of that. There is a reciprocity at work, like a bunch of allies that, you're sort of part of a nice chimp gang, and that means that some big monster, solitary psychopath chimp can't take you out so easily. And that's a very, very interesting thing to contemplate when you're making claims, for example, that human hierarchies are fundamentally based on power. And that's a claim that's made all too often in the modern world with our insistence that our culture, for example, is nothing but a patriarchal tyranny, which implies that it's a unidimensional hierarchy, and that the only thing that regulates position in that hierarchy is something like arbitrary power. It's a very, very pathological view of human society. I think it's motivated by very questionable motivations, and it's certainly predicated on an anthropology that's underinformed, to say the least. Now, once you get to the human level, things get even more complicated, because a friend of mine I worked with for years, I talked a lot about dominance hierarchies in my lectures, and even in 12 Rules for Life I talked about dominance hierarchies, and that was a mistake. My friend, he has just so you know, he has a master's degree in engineering from MIT and a PhD in psychology from Harvard, so he's a very bright guy. He said you shouldn't use the term dominance hierarchy. And I said, why not? It's the standard terminology that's used in the biological sciences. And he said, yeah, but you don't know how much Marxist thinking had infiltrated the biological thinking and affected the terminology, because it's not obvious that hierarchies are predicated on dominance exactly. Hierarchies exist, but whether or not they're dominance hierarchies, that's a whole different story. That's an assumption. And I thought, God, I don't want to hear that. I've been using the idea of dominance hierarchy for like 20 years. I don't want to have to rethink that. So I was annoyed at it for like a month while I was rethinking this through. And then I stumbled across the phrase competence hierarchy, and I thought, oh, that's much better. That's much better. And you see this in other animals too, this competence hierarchy. So there's these cool birds. You could look them up if you want to look up a cool bird. I don't know what you're doing later tonight, but there's these birds called bowerbirds, and they're fascinating birds. And so they have hierarchies too. And they also arrange themselves into a hierarchy, and then they display themselves for the females, and then the females come by and check them out. But they don't use power. So what a bowerbird does is it makes this really fancy nest that sort of hangs from a twig. It's woven together, and then it's lined with something soft. And it's really quite an architectural masterpiece, given that a bird had to build it out of sticks with its beak. It's really something. And then what they do is they make a front yard, they sweep it clean, and then they decorate it with so maybe there'll be a quarter of it that's covered with red petals, and maybe they'll go find some green glass if they can, and then they make a little decoration out of green glass, and they artfully display some twigs over here. And it's a fairly big, the bird is a decent size, and so the whole bowerbird yard is about this big. And then there's a fair number of bowerbirds in the same vicinity, and then the females come and visit each bowerbird art gallery, and they stand there they look, because birds look out of one eye, you know. They have one eye for predators and one eye for things that they eat, by the way, which is quite interesting. So if you ever see a bird eyeing you with the wrong eye and your lunch, or the bird is hoping you would be. But anyways, the females come and eye the display, and they fly off and, you know, check out another one. And if the display attracts a mate, then the bowerbird, the male bowerbird, is all thrilled. But if like 5 or 6 females come and go, then the bowerbird has a little fit and tears his nest apart and erases all his artistic production, and then he does it again. And so that's damn cool. And then there's this other creature called a pufferfish. You know what a pufferfish is. Yep. It's like, it's a fish, you know, for God's sake, it's a fish. And this is what the bloody pufferfish does. You just can't believe this. There's a great video of this. Some of you may have seen this. It's gone quite viral because no one can believe it. This pufferfish, he goes to the bottom of the ocean, as deep as he can go anyways, there's still light down there. And then he makes this amazing, like, sculpture in the sand. It's about 8 feet, he's this big. It's about 8 feet across. And it kind of looks like, you know, those rose stained glass windows? It's kind of got, I mean, it's not detailed like that. It doesn't have images of Christ in it, you know. It's just made out of waves and eddies in the sand, but they're quite deep. They're like this deep, and they're very symmetrical, and the damn thing's almost perfectly round. And that fish, he goes in there and he picks up like stray shells and stuff with his, kind of like a beak, and spits them out, and he does all this by waving his fins. He's got fairly powerful front fins, and he does all this digging by waving his fins and his tail, and he looks at his creation and he swims up and he adjusts this part of it and that part of it. That's also how he attracts mates. And so the idea that hierarchical position based on power is the only regulating factor for the construction of hierarchies that allow access to scarce resources turns out to be quite wrong. Now, even in animals, and it's really wrong in people as far as I'm concerned, because first of all, and this is part of taking the idea of the patriarchal tyranny apart. I hate both parts of that phrase. I don't like the patriarchal part, and I don't like the tyrannical part. I don't like the patriarchal part because it isn't obvious to me that human culture is solely the creation of men. That seems to me to be somewhat of a sexist presupposition to begin with, because I don't think women were just sitting around doing nothing except being oppressed until 1962 when Betty Friedan wrote The Feminist Mystique, and all of a sudden they emerged onto the world stage. That doesn't strike me as a plausible description of the course of human history. And the tyranny part is like, well, this is our culture, the tyranny, that's what we're describing. It's tyranny compared to what? Exactly. It's like it's not perfect. No society is perfect, that's for sure. Every society tends towards blindness, and towards stultification, towards a certain degree of corruption. And a given hierarchy can definitely be taken over by people who only use brute force and power, but that's actually a sign of the degeneration of the hierarchy, not a signal of its appropriate effectiveness. What we do as human beings, first of all, we don't exactly live in a world where we're competing like animals for a finite set of scarce resources. I mean, scarce resources can be a problem. There are some zero-sum games, but we're also pretty damn good at coming up with new games, with new rewards and new rules, and also producing a whole plethora of goods that we didn't have before. So it's not a zero-sum game. And what that means is we don't have one hierarchy, we have many diverse hierarchies, and there's many ways that you can climb to the top, or hope to climb to the top, or at least move slightly upward in many different hierarchies. And so I like to take apart the idea of the tyrannical patriarchy by thinking about it in a more high-resolution manner. And I always think plumbers are a good example, you know, because plumbers have a hierarchy. There's successful plumbers and unsuccessful plumbers. And so there's a hierarchy in terms of wealth, let's say. Some plumbers have whole, like, sequences of plumbing shops, right? They become like plumbing magnets. And, well, why would that be? It's like, well, hypothetically, they know how to fix pipes. That might be like requirement number one, but then obviously they know how to hire employees, and then they know how to keep them, and reasonably happily, because you don't hear very often of sweatshop plumbers being, or plumber slavers who have their plumber employees laboring away in the basement with someone cracking the whip at them. You know, it's usually a fairly, what would you say, free exchange among a plumber and his employees. And then generally, if you're going to be a plumber and you're going to survive for any length of time, you also have to treat your customers with a certain degree of decency and respect and honesty. You have to do the job you were hired to do for the money you were promised, that you promised to charge. And then it actually has to work, because otherwise people write bad reviews on Yelp and so forth, and then soon you're not successful. And then it's pretty obvious that if you hire a plumber, you're not doing it to participate in some sort of power game, except perhaps in the most abstract possible way. You hire a plumber because, well, you don't want sewage in your house, and that seems important, right? We could all more or less agree that that's an individual and a collective good, and so the plumber is servicing that particular need. And then you might phone some people that you know, or some contractors you know, or whatever, and you say, well, do you know a good plumber? You don't say, do you know the most powerful plumber in the neighborhood? You say, do you know a good plumber? And then you get a recommendation, and the good plumber gets even a little bit more business, which puts him even a little higher in the hierarchy of plumbers. And you don't have roving bands of tyrannical plumbers linked arm to arm in a patriarchal, what would you call, phalanx, coming to your door insisting that you hire them or else. And I would say, as ridiculous as that image is, our society is composed of many overlapping hierarchies of that type, almost all of them based to some degree on competence, and usually a competence that we can measure to some degree and that we collectively agree upon is a form of competence. I mean, sometimes it's arbitrary. You know, there's a hierarchy of basketball players, obviously. Some can do it professionally, and very few, tiny percentage of basketball players can do it professionally. And then if you take that tiny percentage of basketball players who can do it professionally, there's even a tinier percentage who happen to be superstars of the type that can manage a multi-million-dollar career over several years, right? A vanishingly small proportion of people. And it's pretty obvious that being able to bounce a basketball and put it through a hoop is a rather arbitrary skill, right? I mean, it could have been a different game, in which case that particular athlete might not have been that good at it, but even if we just generate some arbitrary standard of value, like basketball, which isn't entirely accurate, it has to do with athletic prowess and the ability to hit the target, which is a very important thing in life, but you get a hierarchy that's produced around something as arbitrary as that instantaneously, and no one ever questions that. It's just, it's built into the structure of things that as soon as, and here's the reason for hierarchies. This is what's built into the structure of things. You have a problem. Actually, you have a whole set of them, right? You need to eat, you need to have fresh water, you need to have shelter, you need to have company, you want some luxury, you want some adventure. Like, there are things that, and some of these aren't like strictly necessary, they're things you want, but a lot of them are necessary. If you don't have them, you're in pain, you're anxious, you suffer. So you want to address the suffering, that's a problem. In order to address the suffering, you need a solution to the problem. What people are going to offer you, and what you might offer other people, is the possibility of solving a problem, you know, an individual problem, and one that we identify collectively. As soon as you admit that there's a problem and that a solution needs to be put in place, and someone could offer it, you immediately produce a hierarchy of value, because it becomes valuable to fulfill that requirement. And as soon as you produce that hierarchy, you also produce a hierarchy of talent, because it turns out that no matter what pursuit you determine to pursue,
and then implement collectively, you will inevitably produce an unequal distribution of talent and instantaneously construct a hierarchy. And of course, you're going to do that. How else would you do it? If it's an important problem, like if it's how to design computer chips, for example, which turns out to be a very difficult thing, and you get 100 people together and you want to design a computer chip, the first thing you should do is figure out which of those 100 people actually knows how to design a computer chip. And then that's the person that you should put in the forefront of the hierarchy, unless you don't want to design a computer chip. And it's pretty obvious at that sort of level of technical prowess who's barely able to manage it whatsoever and who is absolutely stellar in comparison. And if your company or your project is operating in a, let's call it, in a functional and honest manner, and it's pursuing a valuable goal, then it organizes itself so the people who are best at pursuing that goal occupy the positions of not power but authority. And how else would you do it? The alternative is, well, everyone is the same. Well, that doesn't work because the talent is unequally distributed. And it also doesn't work with regards to decision making. It's like, if you're in a company and you've got 100 people, and maybe you have to make, I don't know, how many decisions a day? More than one, that's for sure. Let's say 50. If you're going to get everybody together, all 100 people, and they're all going to discuss all 50 options, and then what are they going to do? They're going to vote, or are you going to come to a consensus? It's like, well, voting, even then, you have a hierarchy. You have the people who won the vote against the people who lost. So you have to come to a universal consensus about every decision in the absence of a hierarchical structure. Well, if you want to drive yourself absolutely stark, raving mad, then you set up an organization like that. The empirical literature actually suggests quite clearly that people are happier at work, more satisfied and less anxious when they're in a functional hierarchy where the lines of authority are clearly delineated. Now, that assumes that people observe that there's some relationship between the hierarchical structure and competence, right? Because that's what validates the hierarchy, at least in principle, is competence. Okay, so now, having said that, I would also say, so we need hierarchies. Then I would say, well, this can help us understand political ideation to some degree. There are differences between people who think in a conservative manner and who think in a liberal left manner. There are temperamental differences. And some of them have to do with attitude towards hierarchies, and some of them have to do with attitude towards borders. So the liberal left types are rather skeptical of borders. They're skeptical of conceptual borders around words or concepts, because they don't like things to be locked into one place. They like the dynamic interplay between ideas, because they like new things to be generated. And there's real utility in that, especially if you're locked in a problem that you cannot solve. You need to disintegrate your categorical structures and restructure them so that you can get yourself out of being stuck and move forward. So there's real utility in that. Whereas the more conservative people, they think, look, we've got these things in their boxes, in their nested boxes even, and things aren't working too badly, so let's not muck about with the categorical structure any more than we have to. Let's keep the borders between things intact at every level of conceptualization, right up to the political itself. Because the conservative types tend to be more supportive of the idea of solidity of borders, let's say, where the liberal types think, no, we want to make the borders permeable because we want a free flow of goods and ideas. And it's like, who's right? And the answer is, well, it depends on the circumstance. Sometimes the border should be tighter, the wall should be higher, and sometimes the border should be looser, and more ideas should move back and forth. It depends on where you are in your culture. If things are getting too structured and rigid, time to release the borders, time to make them more permeable. But what if everything's falling apart and everyone's confused? It's like, well, maybe you want to shore up the institutions to some degree. And the question is, well, how the hell do you know when to do what? And the answer is, by arguing about it. And I'm absolutely dead serious about this. This is why I think, fundamentally, why I think that free speech is the canonical freedom and responsibility. Because if there are these two
goods, hierarchical structure, or borders, like I'm using borders as an example at the moment, border solidity versus border permeability, each of which is advantageous at different stages in cultural development as the years roll by, then the only way to decide if you're positioned properly as a culture on that continua between those two opposing views is to have it out. And that's what we do. That's what we have elections. The left-wingers, they say what they have to say, so my God, they also do the same with hierarchies. So the right wing tends to, and it's associated with this idea of maintaining categorical integrity. The system is working pretty damn well the way it is. And mostly it's based on competence, so don't muck about with it. And the left-wingers say, yeah, but it's tilting towards tyranny, it's kind of stultified and blind, and the people at the bottom don't have as much opportunity to rise to the top as might be good for everyone. Right? And they also criticize even the idea of hierarchy itself, because one of the consequences of producing a hierarchy, and this is an inevitable consequence, is that the bulk of well, there's two things. If you produce a hierarchy, the bulk of the creative work is done by a small minority of people. That's the first thing. The square root of the number of people who are doing a job do half the work. That's the rule. That's the Pareto principle. And so it's a killer rule, man, because it means if you have 10 employees, 3 of them do half the work. Everyone understands that. But if you have 100, 10 of them do half the work, and if you have 1,000, 30 of them do half the work. And so that's a killer principle. It also explains why large companies tend to collapse, right? Because once you get up to 1,000, you've got 970 people who are only doing half the work and 30 that are doing the other half. And then your company wavers a little bit. You know, you have a bad quarter, and the 30 that are doing half the work think, ciao, man, we'll see you later. I've got opportunities elsewhere. And then you're left with the 970 people who are only doing half the work. That's right. Instant death spiral. And that happens to companies way faster than you think. In any case, you get this creativity distribution, which I just described, and that's rough, but you also get an income distribution problem that's the same. And so that's why it's exactly the same principle. And it isn't necessarily that the creative hard workers are also the ones that get the most income. It's not like there's a one-to-one relationship between those things. You want it to be close, because otherwise your hierarchy isn't functioning worth a damn. But it's not going to be identical, because no system works that way. And people gerrymander the system, and sometimes people get paid more than they should, and sometimes people get paid less, and, because no system is perfect. But in any case, one of the consequences of producing hierarchical entities is that a disproportionate amount of the revenue, the goods, the wealth, flow to a tiny minority of people. And so that's why you have the richest 13 people have as much money as the bottom, I think it's 2 billion, something like that. And you have the infamous 1%, that control the vast majority of wealth. You're all in that 1%, by the way, just so you know, because maybe not all of you, but pretty much all of you, to be in the top 1% worldwide, you need an income of $32,000 a year. So, who's in the 1% depends very much on how large you make the population pool. And it's a little bit disingenuous, I would say, to say, well, let's reduce the geographical locale across which we're calculating comparative incomes until we're poor, despite the fact that we're actually not, and so that there's a 1% that's way above us, and we can assume that they're rich in some pathological manner. It's like, if they're rich in some pathological manner, then so are you. They're richer, so maybe they're better at it than you in their pathological manner, but historically speaking, and even in terms of comparison across the world, it's definitely you. And I don't think that that's necessarily such a bad thing, in some sense, because some people have to be rich first before everybody can be rich at all. And you might think, well, that's a hell of a thing to say, but I don't really think it is, because if you look at what happens to consumer prices, for example, you want some gadget like a 55-inch TV. It's like, you can get one of those things now for probably 200 pounds. I mean, they're very inexpensive. But when they first came out, they were like 20,000 pounds or 50,000 pounds, and right early on 100,000 pounds, and so only the rich guy up the street had one. Well, it's a good thing there were some people around that had excess pools of capital, because they would have never bought things to begin with and driven the price down so that the rest of us could afford them. And so one of the things that's useful about rich people is they can produce a market for really cool things that you get to have a little later. And you don't get as much status for it, but at least you get the damn thing. That's something. So, okay, so the right supports hierarchies and borders and conceptual categories, and likes to keep them relatively intact, and there's reasons for that. And the left says, wait a second, the categories are too rigid, we're not letting information flow, the hierarchy is too corrupt, and plus there's all these people who are stacking up at the bottom. And that's the other thing that happens in hierarchies, is that not only does a disproportionate amount of the goods, let's say, flow to the top, but the largest number of people stack up close to the bottom. And so then you have this eternal problem of this inequality. And that can get so steep that it actually threatens the stability of the hierarchy itself. Because one of the things we know is that if inequality steepens too much, especially if there's no way of moving from the bottom to the top, then the young men that are trapped at the bottom get violent. And so even if you're a conservative type, one of the things you might think is, well, we don't want to steepen the damn hierarchy too much, and we don't want to restrict access to mobility too much, because then the people at the bottom, they have nothing to lose. And if you have something, the only person that can beat you is the person who has nothing, because they have nothing to lose. And so you don't want to have too many people around that have nothing if you have something, because they don't have anything to lose. And so even if you're just a selfish capitalist, you might think, well, you know, let's keep the painful inequality to some moderate minimum so that the whole damn thing doesn't destabilize. All right. Part of the reason, so there's a bit of a validation for a left wing, and a bit of a validation for a right wing, and even more validation for the idea that you need to communicate across those different political viewpoints. And one of the things you might also be interested to know is that those political viewpoints are not entirely, but in large part influenced by biological factors. So this is a cool thing, and it's only been figured out in about the last 15 years. So once we got a decent personality model, the same models, by the way, that have been used to show that there are gender differences in personality and that they maximize as societies become more egalitarian, same line of research, we found that conservatives tend to be high in a trait called conscientiousness. And conscientiousness is the second best predictor of socioeconomic success after intelligence. It's an important predictor, and it's a predictor of marital stability and life satisfaction. And, like, it's good to be conscientious. Makes you a little square. That's a good way of thinking about it. But as a long-term strategy, it's a good one. Orderliness and industriousness. And the conservatives are particularly high in orderliness. And that seems to be that proclivity to keep things where they're supposed to be, right? And as conservatives, orderly types, it isn't that they're afraid of disorder exactly. That was a theory that was very current among psychologists for a long period of time. But it turned out that conservatives are actually less neurotic than liberals. They're lower in negative emotion. And so the whole fear thing didn't pan out very well. But what seems to maybe be the case is that conservative types who are orderly are sensitive to disgust. And so that when category boundaries are violated, the emotion that they experience is disgust, kind of a judgmental disgust. And so I found that extremely interesting when I was reading biography of Hitler. I read this book called Hitler's Table Talk. It's a very interesting book. It was a collection of his spontaneous speeches, diatribes, let's say, at meal times in the evening from I think 1939 to 1942, and they were just recorded by secretaries, and so he just got a sense of what Hitler thought about everything. And he was a very strange person because he was very high in trait openness, which actually is a liberal trait. He's a very creative person, surprisingly enough, but he was also extremely orderly. And so, a devotee of willpower, right? So he's very proud of his ability, for
example, to stand in the back of a car, going through the hordes of people that were worshipping him, and to stand by fist for like 8 hours at a time. He saw that as a signal application of will. And he was also obsessed with hygiene. Right? He bathed 4 times a day, for example. And a lot of, I learned this, I took apart what happened as Hitler, what would you say, accelerated his purification strategies. So one of the things the Germans did right off the bat was to institute public health programs. And so they produced these vans that would go around and do TB screening. So they're trying to get rid of tuberculosis. Seems like a good thing. Pathogen concern, driven by disgust. And then the next thing they did was decide, well, why don't we clean up the damn factories? Too many rats, too many mice, not enough flowers, too much dirt. And so they had the Germans fumigate the factories to get rid of the vermin. They used Zyklon. Zyklon, I think A, there were 2 variants. One Zyklon was used in death camps and the other was used as a general insecticide, pesticide. And so that's where that started. And so they started to clean up the factories, which seemed like an okay thing, but then they decided they were also going to clean up the mental institutions. And that was starting to push the envelope, let's say, a little bit too far, right? And then that just went completely out of hand. And if you read what Hitler said, it's absolutely fascinating because he regarded the Aryan race as a body. That was his central metaphor, a body that was under assault by pathogens. And so that's why he was always talking about purity of blood. And so his desire to eradicate wasn't driven by fear, it was driven by disgust. And it was a consequence of excess orderliness. So, and you can tell that too. I mean, if you look at how the Nazis arrayed themselves in their political displays, at Nuremberg, for example, which was this massive display area, huge grounds where all the Nazis would gather in perfect squares, right? Absolutely perfect. Thousands of people lined up in absolute precision. And then when they goose-stepped and marched, everyone was exactly the same. It's orderliness gone mad. And orderliness is actually one of the sine qua non of an industrialized society. And that's one of the things that makes that so terrifying, because it also means that part of what drove the Germans, for example, to their high levels of engineering excellence, for which they were absolutely renowned, not only in World War II, but certainly even now, was that orderliness, that unbelievable orderliness. And the thing is, it can get seriously out of hand. And so that's a fascinating thing to know. It was one of the most shocking things I ever stumbled across as a social scientist. And I really found it quite alarming, because there's a reason to be orderly and disgust sensitive. And the reason to be disgust sensitive is because you want to protect yourself from foreign pathogens. You have to, because you'll die. It's certainly the case that many times in human history, where cultures came together that had been separated, the results were absolutely catastrophic. That happened to Europe with the bubonic plague, for example. It happened to the North American Indians when the Europeans showed up, right? Rife with syphilis and all sorts of other diseases, mumps and measles and smallpox, right? 95% of the Native Americans died. So many of them died that by the time the Pilgrims came to the East Coast, the Indians were desperate to have new people because they couldn't even get their crops off. So that was all very frightening, because it showed that what happened in the case of Germany was, at least in part, the elaboration of an instinct that was designed, in fact, to protect people from actual pathogenic exposure. It just gone too far. And of course, everything can go too far. Conservatives are higher in conscientiousness, especially orderliness, and they're lower in trait openness. And openness is the creativity dimension. And if you're an open person, you tend to like aesthetics, you tend to like philosophy, you tend to like movies, you tend to like literature, you tend to like art, you have a sense of it, and you also are interested in ideas for their own sake. And that also makes you someone who, if someone throws you an idea, 6 or 7 ideas will make themselves manifest in your imagination. So the boundaries between ideas are more permeable for creative people. And to sort of be conservative, you have to be relatively non-creative, and you have to be orderly. And to be liberal, especially on the left, as you move towards the left, then orderliness goes down and openness goes up. because all you see then is the utility of moving laterally across borders, something like that. And now, what's so interesting about that is that both of those are extremely useful sets of traits, because sometimes you should just do the things exactly the same way that everyone has always done them for time immemorial. It's a hell of a fine strategy. If it's already worked, keep doing it. But sometimes that's fatal. And so then you need a creative person who's willing to transgress against the boundaries and generate something new so that you can get out of your now counterproductive box. And so it's the same thing with regards to the political dialogue that I described earlier, except now it's a dialogue between biological types. Should we stay the same or should we change? We don't know, so we better talk about it. And that's why, again, free speech is so absolutely necessary, because that's the mechanism by which people who truly differ, can come to some reasonable consensus and keep the whole ship of state relatively on course. Now, the reason that I talked about lobsters in particular with regards to hierarchies is because I was trying to make a criticism. I was trying to put forward a criticism of Marxism. But it was a funny thing, because this is in chapter 1 still. It was a criticism of Marxism that I was actually trying to make from the leftist perspective. So let's say for a minute that you accept this proposition. There's going to be hierarchies. And they're problem-solving social technologies. Okay, now, but they have a problem. And the problem is that the problem of inequality and the problem of dispossession of those at the bottom. It's a big problem. And maybe you want to do something about that. And maybe you should, because why not have some compassion for people who are dispossessed? Especially the case for, children, because it's not obvious. Maybe you're dispossessed because you've never done a lick of work in your life, and you deserve to be barely clinging to the edge of reality because of that, And I'm not saying that that's the primary reason that people become dispossessed. But it is one of them. There's many, many reasons. Ill health, bad luck, God, there's an endless array of reasons that can throw you down to the bottom. Old age can do that. And so can extreme youth. It's not necessarily such a good thing that dispossessed children stack up at the bottom, because they don't have the opportunities they might need. And even if you're just a greedy capitalist, well, that's kind of foolish, because maybe you want those kids to grow up and invent something like new and luxurious that you can have that no one else can have, right? So it's a fool's game to keep people at the bottom if you can allow them access through their competence and talents to something approximating the top.